È un breve saluto a nome del Centro Culturale di Milano e di Admira Fotografi che in questi giorni hanno inaugurato negli spazi del Centro Culturale la mostra L'uomo e la terra, luci e ombre di Ed Burtynsky. Abbiamo il grande onore e la grande possibilità di poterlo incontrare e ascoltare. Questa mostra così importante perché regala a Milano un po' una primogenitura rispetto al nostro paese, all'Italia, perché è la prima esposizione di Burtynsky. È un fotografo grandissimo, di grande lavoro, e cercheremo di scoprire anche i segreti della scelta dei suoi soggetti, il segreto anche della sua tecnica, della sua angolatura visiva e concezione estetica. Il bel libro, catalogo, Quaderni del CMC numero 4, che forse avete intravisto all'ingresso, bene documenta il suo lavoro con più di 60 immagini tratte da vari continenti in cui lui ha lavorato, e con due bei testi, uno un'intervista di Enrica Viganò che ha curato la mostra e che ringrazio personalmente perché ci ha fatto conoscere e incontrare l'opera di Burtynsky, e quando l'abbiamo vista l'abbiamo voluta, e io ringrazio molto anche lui perché ha concesso tanto, ha concesso in possibilità anche realizzative dal Canada qui a Milano, aiutando il Centro Culturale e Admira a realizzare questa occasione che durerà ben 2 mesi. L'altro scritto sul catalogo è di Giuseppe Frangi, che poi ci raggiungerà insieme a Enrica Viganò al termine della conversazione che terrà Burtynsky, e dopo la quale potremo rivolgere alcune domande a lui direttamente. La sua sarà una conversazione con immagini e dunque lo ringraziamo e ci apprestiamo a assorbire con grande energia il suo racconto. Grazie.
Good evening, and thank you, Camilo. Thank you very much, and I'd like to also thank the staff at CMC for doing their excellent work and helping us organize this show. And Enrica, always a pleasure working with you, and thank you for continuing to bring my work to Europe. So thank you very much. Enrica and I have worked before on different projects, and it looks like we may be working into the future on different projects as well. So it's great to have the support of a fantastic curator. This evening, I'm going to give you a tour of my work, and it'll pretty much be spanning about 25 years of what I've been doing with man in the landscape. And part of my thinking in terms of doing this work comes out of I think, my being Canadian. And part of that Canadian experience is that in Canada we have a very small population, 30 million people, and we have after Russia, we're the second largest landmass country on the planet. And that leaves a lot of space, and almost 85% of Canadians are located, as I am, along the 49th parallel, right on the border of the United States and Canada. And the rest of it, the other 15%, populate the far north. So the north of Canada is pretty much, empty. And I had a chance, and I had the opportunity to see that land and see what it looks like before we humans go in there and change it. And to me, that's an important thing because that gives me a reference point. And to illustrate that reference point, it'd be, for instance, if you lived in Holland. And Holland is, 50% of the country is recaptured from the ocean. It's all man-made. It's a complete synthetic landscape. Every tree is planted because somebody wanted that tree there. Every bush is there because somebody wanted it there. Somebody planted it. Yes, there's a bit of nature scattered here and there, but it's a pretty controlled landscape. Every square meter has been divided and owned by someone. And then contrast that with coming from Canada and just the sheer scale of looking at raw nature is incomparable to something like living in Holland and never leaving Holland. And I think because I had that experience as a young boy and that kind of sense that when you're looking at a landscape, when I canoed by the shoreline with a small canoe that we would have to transport ourselves through small lakes in Canada, I imagined that the shore that I was looking at was the same shore that, let's say, the first Indians who came there saw 10,000 years ago, or the animals that swam in that lake and looking towards the shore saw 20, 30, 50,000 years ago, that this landscape was something, this is what the Earth's surface looks like before we enter. And although I tried at a very early stage, if we can dim the lights down just a bit more, especially on the screen. So I tried very early on to make pictures of this natural landscape, nature itself. And I spent a couple of years photographing it. This is one example where I'm just looking at grasses coming through in the spring from after the snow has lifted off the ground. So, but in that taking photographs of that landscape, I found myself running into a problem where I couldn't find a way to translate what I felt was something that was in my time, that it had a currency, that there were photographers in the past like Ansel Adams and Edward Weston and photographers of that generation, and they had captured, even Carlton Watkins in the past, and they had captured that landscape, and they were trying to preserve, I guess, that pristine beauty and to show it, and in the case of Carlton Watkins and Ansel Adams, it was their photographs that were used in the American Congress that was the evidence of why they should build a national park system, and that park system still exists today. But it was based on the strength of those images of the wilderness that those parks and that whole legislation was passed. And me trying to make those images, I found there was something missing. As much as I enjoyed trying to capture that place, it didn't feel right. Something didn't feel right. And so then, to put myself through photography school, I had to work in industry. And I became very fascinated with the industrial landscape, the place where we go and get the things that we need, whether it's iron ore or nickel, gold, all the things that we consume on a regular basis all have to come from a landscape. It all comes from nature. And that started to weigh in on me. I started to think that as a photographer and as somebody who wants to create a series of landscapes that are more important and more relevant to our times, how do I begin to talk about that place out there in nature that we take the things for our daily consumption? And I also recognized at quite a young age that something was changing, that we were in a population explosion of unprecedented proportions. In fact, when I was born, there was 2.5 billion people in 1955. And we were about to hit 7 billion. That's almost a billion per decade. That is in fact, that's almost a tripling of our population in a mere 55 years. And that's what was different. That's what I was seeing in that landscape. Because Canada is largely a resource-based economy. 50% of our economy is about taking things from nature, extracting things from nature. And having worked in those mines and seen them firsthand and understood how they worked, and I understood how factories work, because I worked in all those industries because they paid well, and I needed reasonable money to go into a photography program because I needed film and cameras and lenses and all of that, and that had to be supplied by myself, and my parents weren't able to help me at that stage in their lives, so it was really left to me to do that. But it gave me that look at those industries, and that began what I call my life's work, in that somehow I wanted to have the camera go into those places that we don't see, that we no longer are connected to, and to reconnect us through photography to those landscapes, to the places where we take from nature. So one of the things that occurred to me, one of my first significant projects was like a 3-part series. It was rail cuts, mines, and so that we needed the rail to cross the country to get to the minerals in the Rocky Mountains, so we built a rail across the land, and this is part of that rail system. The mines, we built mines once the rails were in there. And also the other thing I did was homesteads, how we carved our small homes in this vast landscape and connect ourselves to that land. So those are the first 3 ideas that I went. And this is a rail cut going through the Rockies in British Columbia. And what I did here is I looked at the 19th century photography. So my ideas were coming out of the history of photography, but I had to change them. So in the original photography of the rail going through the Rocky Mountains, it was always heroic. It was always the train, with the steam puffing around a bend, the river, the mountains, snow-capped mountains. It was always to celebrate and to create a desire to want to go there. Where I chose to photograph it in a very different way. I confronted it flat on. So you look at and nature is predominantly the top 3/4 or more of the image. And then there's this line that runs through that landscape, and in this case there's a line with a train, and it has a cargo in the bins of the train that is the same color of the landscape. And to me it was a great metaphor for the taking, our forever drawing the resources from the landscape. And so it was a meditation. It was a way to think about that landscape, and what does that human engineered line through that precarious landscape mean to that landscape? And how is it that I can begin to develop a language around landscape that begins to talk about man and nature and how we interact with that thing that we refer to? In that one might think that man is from and part of nature, but it's our cultural and our linguistic development has separated us. So there are humans and then there is nature, and that may be one of the most dangerous divides that culture and language has ever done, because it dangerously puts nature as something outside of ourselves. And that's a dangerous proposition, in that, if we do something to nature, if we harm nature, we in fact over time harm ourselves. And we've seen that now through pollution, and now we're seeing it through climate change, and we're seeing it through unprecedented and unpredictable weather, and water and land and deforestation, and all these things are beginning to find limits. And I didn't certainly understand that when I stepped out into this project 25, 30 years ago. I didn't understand how quickly we could change this planet. And it's only in the last decade that I begin to fully understand the implications of man's ecological footprint on the planet. So I went through and did the Railcut series. So that was my first kind of well-understood series. And then I went to do open pit mines. So I went to find the largest. And one of the things that allowed me to move from the kind of general idea, I want to do a mine. I want to do a copper mine or an iron ore mine. So how do I begin? There are thousands of them, of each one of them. So to move from the general idea of photographing a mine to the specific mine, which one and why? I used a very simple principle. I found the biggest one I could find. And wherever it was, I would go in search of the largest mine, withdrawing the greatest amount of ore per day for the longest period of time, therefore leaving a void, leaving a hole that one might consider the largest example of our extraction. And that became a guiding principle in almost all of my work from that point, because it was very hard to do this body of work because it was such a vast idea. There's so many of them, like an iron ore mines, like literally there are thousands of them. Which one, why? So that gave me a way to begin my research. It gave me a set of parameters in which I could begin to discover. This is the largest open pit mine in America, some say in the world, because they had to remove the top of a mountain to get to this ore body. It's around Salt Lake City in Utah. It's called the Bingham Valley Copper Mine. And the interesting thing about this copper mine is that it began to inform my ideas in a way that still connected me with the history of art. As I'm sure most of you have, at some point in your lives, heard of the sublime and the notion of the sublime. The Romantics, Caspar David Friedrich and Turner and others of that ilk, saw the sublime as man in the face of the omnipresent forces of nature, that we are awed by that force, that we are diminished by that force, and yet we are also lifted. It was also a vaulting feeling of power, and so, for instance, Turner's ship being lost at sea, and the power of a storm, of a gale force storm swallowing up a ship, or Caspar David Friedrich with a ship stranded in an ice field where it's diminished in size and nature has kind of overthrown or overpowered our small presence in the landscape. So what I felt, fast forward the Industrial Revolution, 250 years forward, and now we are working at a scale. So to me, this image was a complete inversion of the sublime, in that in our technology and in our ability to form steel into ships and to be able to make jets that fly over the storms at 33,000 feet, find ships that don't break up at sea when a gale force wind comes along. And furthermore, we began to build cars that cooled us in the summer and heated us in the winter, as well as our homes were outfitted with air conditioners and furnaces to regulate our environments. And in our isolating ourselves from the forces of nature, from that great sublime force, we, as a species, unleashed a new sublime, and that is us, that we are now a force upon nature. And in this type of image, I felt that the human being and what we do, we are now diminished in a landscape of our own making, that this is an awesome, fearsome force, and we are small players in a theater of industry that needs to produce enough material for us to live the lives that we lead on the scale of 7 billion people. This here is, again, one of the largest, this is the other competing largest mine in the world, like mine on any level. It's also an open pit mine. 25,000 men work here, and it's in northern Chile, in the driest place on the planet. The last recorded rainfall in this landscape was 50 years ago. There's nothing living in this landscape. There are there's no moss, no bugs, no flies, nothing. It's bone dry. But nonetheless, they bring the water by pipe from the Andes and have been mining this for over close to 100 years. And this one place, this one hole in the ground, supplies 30% of the copper in the world. That is a statistic they gave me. If one thinks about that, what comes out of this landscape, each one of us probably engages in the material from that open pit mine every day of our lives. Even when we pick up a phone to make a call to our friend, I'm sure the copper somewhere along that phone call will have come from here, or the car that you start will have a winding which the copper will have come from this mine. So in many respects, this began to shape my idea of how we're connected to these landscapes, all of us. We're all implied. This isn't pointing a finger at that industry or that company or anything. It's the fact that human beings need to take things from nature to survive. We always have. Every living thing has to take something from nature to survive. But what's changed is we've become what I've coined, who someone coined, a rogue species, a runaway species on the planet. And now we're shifting, and we are now creating, I believe, what is now being referred to as, like we are currently in the Holocene, which has been a very peaceful, period in geological time. And now they're saying that the beginning of the geologists are saying from the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, we've moved into a new scene, and it's called the Anthropocene, the scene of man. And it may be a short one, depends on how we react to the way we're changing the planet. This here is an example of tailings. As we remove stone from the ground to get the materials that we need, this is a nickel mine. There's all that residual, the very small percentage of all the stone that's brought out and crushed. Only 5% at most is the material that we need. So 95% is stone that we don't use or has no further use. And it has to be put somewhere. They can't put it back in the hole. So that creates, every mine has what's called a tailings. And so I went and photographed tailings as well and did a whole series on that. And then it also occurred to me that to build our cities, we see plenty of evidence of it in a city like Milan or Rome. We build our cities with blocks of stone. So we had to go to the landscape to remove the stone a block at a time. And for me, the interesting thing was, and it was really an act of the imagination, because I had never seen these types of residual quarries, these types of landscapes where stone has been removed dimensionally and carefully removed by the block. And I thought it would create a residual landscape that was almost an inversion of architecture, an inverse architecture. This is the quarries, the famous quarries of Carrara. I'm sure many of you are familiar with them. They're here in Italy. And what happened was, when I was photographing these big quarries in Vermont, the people there told me that there were fantastic quarries in Italy, in near Carrara. And I had never gone abroad. I've never flown and taken my equipment to another country where I didn't speak the language to make work. When I heard it, and then I did some research on these quarries, I said, I must go there. I must photograph that place. And then I worked through researchers and found help, and in fact, it was in Milan where it began. There was a company called Industria, and I called them and I said, is there an assistant that could help me gain access to Carrara and drive me there and be my translator? And lo and behold, they found a really excellent assistant for me, and thus began my first trip abroad to make my work. And little did I know at that time, because it was very successful and I did it well and it worked out, that this now gave me the idea to no longer restrict myself to North America, that this gave me the encouragement to go forward and be able to use the whole planet as my subject, as my raw material for my ideas. So once I did that, once I did Italy, I then started to go elsewhere, Australia, China, India, Bangladesh, and on, all through Europe. So it really did begin a period of thinking, not in terms of countries or not in terms, but in terms of continents and what's on that continent, what activities are going on there that I think would add to the ideas in the body of work. This is again a huge mine in Australia, a gold mine, and this is probably the largest in terms of volume and the richest iron ore mine in the world, and it's located in northwestern Australia, and this supplies almost all of this iron ore. Goes by ship from Port Hedland in northwest Australia to China. It goes right to Shanghai, it goes along the coast of China, and it supplies the big machine that produces all the fridges and stoves and all the things that we buy from China. Also, when I went to Australia, I decided to begin to look at mining from a different perspective. And I began to look at mining as an aerial view of it. And in terms of thinking of it that way, it gave me a whole other perspective of how we shaped the earth and how we carved the earth. I wanted to go further than just showing the open pits. I wanted to show how those landscapes existed within within the greater landscape, the transformed landscape shown within context. And this was, the work became quite an abstract work as well, because I was working with salt lakes. So these were all mines that were in salt lakes, and these salt lakes were often dry, but it had rained about 4 or 5 days. So there was water on top of the salt. So then the water picked up the clouds that were above me, and it was rarely a cloudy period in that area. But again, when I do my research, I found that in the month that I was there, had the highest probability of clouds and rain. So I went with probabilities to be in that landscape at the right time. And everything I do is timed to have that landscape appear the way I would like it. Where I like the colors, where I like the light, where I like the time of year. But again, I've been doing quite a bit of work now from helicopters, and that's been quite interesting because it does tell the story of how we shape that landscape. This now moves me to the project on China, and I'll work through that fairly quickly. China, again, for me to look at how we're kind of reshaping the planet, how we're expanding, I couldn't not go to China. 1.3 billion people, all moving towards a middle class, all wanting what we have. And thinking about that and trying to understand what that means, what that idea implies. And so one of the first things it means is that they need an awful lot of energy to do that. And so this, largely, the Three Gorges Dam, this is the Yangtze River. This is 2/3 built, and before it was filled. And it was going to produce something like that dam produces 25,000 megawatts of power. And just to give perspective on that, a nuclear reactor, a nuclear power plant is about 1,000. So this one dam would be like building 25 nuclear reactors in one place. And this is one of many dams. I'm continuing to work on this project, but this is one of many dams that China has built. But this dam in particular is the largest by double of any other dam built on the planet. In fact, when they built this dam, and they filled it. It took 15 days to fill the reservoir, and during that 15 days, astrologers who had really pinpoint accuracy on fixed on stars with telescopes, they could tell. Like they could tell if an earthquake happens, they can see that there's a wobble in the earth. When they filled this reservoir, they measured a wobble in the earth from the weight of the reservoir, which went back 600 kilometers. So again, here's a case where we're working on a scale that actually can wobble the planet. And to me, that was a very kind of sobering thought. This is the nuclear reactors. This is as they call on the left-hand side, that's the money room. That's where all the turbines are. And the turbines, these are the turbines. So each one of these turbines is 700 megawatts. So one of those turbines is putting out the amount of energy almost to a nuclear power plant. Another 300 megawatts and you'd have a nuclear reactor. To do that, they had to move 2 million people. Some say 4, we'll never know. But I think it's probably more than 2 million, maybe less than 4 would be my guess. But they had to remove these cities, they had to flatten these cities. And they used the people who lived in these towns to do the work. They were paid so much per pound for any metal work that they could bring from the windows or from stairs or from any metal they can bring, they got paid by the pound. Every brick that wasn't broken, they got paid a few cents. And so the cities were being taken down brick by brick by the people who lived in those same cities. And this was, I went in September 2002 and then went back 10 weeks later hoping to capture the city, hoping to get up into that city on the left to shoot from the windows and shoot the breaking down of, this was one of the biggest, Fengji, one of the biggest cities that was flattened. And in 10 weeks they had totally flattened it. So when I got back I found nothing but a wasteland. And what I found as well was that in the urban renewal of China, this is in Shanghai, things were changing, that the government was having a hard time because the media was having more of a presence to just flatten somebody's house, even though they weren't willing to take the deal that the government and the city mayor or the city department was offering them and the developer. So these were known as holdouts. So these were Chinese residents who weren't willing to take the deal that they were offering. Everybody else has taken the deal, and the minute you accept the deal, the next day the house is flattened. So there were about a dozen of these kinds of homes left where they were, and the reporters were around, and there was a lot of controversy. I was, for the first time, apprehended taking these photographs and taken to the police station, and they wanted to know why I was photographing these homes. I didn't see any harm in it, but I didn't realize how politically sticky the situation was. This is not my photograph, but this was the most famous holdout. So they wanted I think the resident wanted £1 million and not a penny less. And they said to the media and to the government, I'm not leaving until hell freezes over. But it became famous. It became almost iconographic, this photograph in China, for the fact that it showed that there was a resistance to all of this relocation, and it was starting to show with these types of events. And these were the new cities being built. And they sprung up very quickly on higher ground, very quickly built. This is Wushan. It was a city that I think had about 150,000 citizens. And I asked the deputy mayor how much it cost to build the city, because the government paid for it. And the number came back surprisingly low. It was about $60 million at the time to build a whole city for 150,000 people. Anybody who looks at high-rises in contemporary Western cities, then that's not outrageous to pay that for one building. And I think that's the speed in which we see China evolving, because it's the fastest growing urbanization on the planet. When Mao Zedong, lost his reign, or when the power shifted to Deng Xiaoping, it was 90% agrarian and 10% urban. It is currently about 40% urban and 60% agrarian, and the government would like to see it go to 70% urban and 30% agrarian. And when you start thinking of those numbers, it's very sobering. 30% of 1.3 billion, and some are now thinking that it's 1.5, but let's say 1.3 billion, 30% of that is over 400,000 citizens that are going to move from the country to the city. 400,000 is the complete population of Canada, United States, and Mexico put together. So, and they were thinking of that in the next 15 years. So it's trying to imagine the building of the infrastructure, the hospitals, the roadways, the schools, and the homes and the apartments for a population the scale of all of North America. Again, a very unprecedented ideas and numbers. And you start looking at the kind of international style that Bauhaus had begun. I don't think they ever imagined this world would become, because part of the Bauhausian, high-rise was to allow a higher density, to allow the worker to have his own place. But the idea was originally that the floor plate, let's say you have 100 square meters per floor, or let's say 1,000 square meters per floor plate of an apartment, and it's 20 stories high, so you have 20,000 square meters. Well, the vision they had was that you had to build 20,000 square meters, or reserve 20,000 square meters of park right beside that building, so that the people in that high density would have a place in which they can release their kind of density and that living on top of each other. Well, they left the second part of the equation out, and it's just high rises now, and it's on a density. This is Shanghai. It was the fastest growing city in all of China. It was growing at about 1 million people per year. In inland China, it was, again, a billboard I came across. These are government-sponsored billboards. And what I found interesting is that all the Chinese were totally covered in Western styles, plaid shirts, tuxes, even the hairstyles, bouquet of flowers. And there was a manicured park behind them, and behind the manicured park is a refinery. So ultimately, it's all the kind of signs, all the visual signs were in pursuit of Western ideals to a middle-class existence, and that oil was going to get them there. That source of energy was going to allow them, which, quite frankly, is how the West had built a middle class. It's through the automobile, and it's through the discovery of oil and cheap gas. This is in Guangzhou, where all the workers, there's 130 million transient workers that go from the countryside to jobs, and that's why Chinese New Year's, which is happening right now, is the greatest mobility of any culture is happening right now in China, where 130 million people who live and work in factories, in the big factory towns, go from there back to their country home to visit their children and their grandparents who are normally raising their kids. There's a great movie that was just put out recently called Last Train Home, and it speaks about, and it shows you the scale of that moving of the 130 million people. This is showing you a shoe factory. This shoe factory is the largest shoe factory. Again, you hear largest, it is. It's 250,000 employees. This is 1/3 of the staff, of one area, which is, there's 21,000 staff, workers in this one area, and this is 7,000 of them going at once to dinner. They can feed about that 7,000 in less than half hour, and then another 7,000 comes, and they do 21,000, feed 21,000 workers in about an hour and 20 minutes. They make 1 billion pairs of shoes a year. Again, the largest shoe factory in the world. This is a worker's dorm. So this is how, when they come from the countryside, they are given an apartment in one of these dorms, and this is how their day-to-day existence is in one of these units. I also looked at shipbreaking. China's now, I think now has become the largest shipbreaker. At the time it was a third, but 5 years later, from when I shot these, they are now the largest shipbreakers. China needs a phenomenal amount of steel to do this. This is Bao Steel, the largest steel plant in China. It has 6 cupolas. See, these are blast furnaces. This is a new one. There's 6th one going in. They were just building it when I was there. And to service, this image is on display here at CMC. The service that they need to melt all that iron ore, and they need vast sums of coal. So this is the big piles of coal. China has 40% of the world's reserves of coal. It's not very good coal, it's very dirty, full of sulfur, which creates acid rain as well. But after the United States, which has about 40%, and China has about 40%, and then the rest is distributed around the world. We have some in Canada, there's a lot in Australia, a few other places. But this is coal in every direction. I was standing on top of a building, and if you look in every direction of that top rooftop, it went as far as the eye can see. It was something like 20 square kilometers of coal of different grades and varieties, all being redistributed and sold around the country. China also became the center for the world for recycling. These recycling operations are around every big city, and a lot of times the country people come and they begin to recycle. This is electronics. This is how your computer is recycled. It's little shops or little work areas on front porches, and they use hammers and smash all the chips from our computers and take out all, with tweezers, they take out all the electronic bits, all the metal. So this is all hand work. This is, again, a portrait of when I was shooting, they said, "Do you want to see the oldest person who lives in this town?" And I said, "Sure." And so they brought her out. She was 95 years old, and her house is now, her front porch is now a computer recycling operation. And I thought, this woman, she's seen so much. She was there during the dynasty, and she saw the dynasty collapse, and the republic came in, and so then it was a republic for about 40 years, and then that was taken over by the communists, so that she saw 3 major regime changes, and now this last reform, the 4th kind of phase of China, I refer to it as a kind of a command capitalism. It really isn't communism anymore. It's a centrally controlled capitalist system now. These are all the computer boards that are melted, and all the chips are taken off, but inside the boards, there's still some metal. There's still silver, and there's still different aluminums and silvers, so they grind these boards up and reclaim all the metal from that. So this is going to give you an idea of the industry. She's making a circuit breaker for a panel, a circuit panel on a wall for electricity. So she would make about 400 of these a day. And what's interesting in China is that all of these parts, all of these things that they're using are the best parts you can get. The wire, the components are all made automated and made with machinery. But where they're using their workforce is as assemblers. They don't use robotics. They have the millions of Chinese as a workforce. So if you go into a Chinese car factory, you'll find that there are no robotics. It's all workers that are being paid between $5 and $10 a day, and that's far less expensive. And they can produce a car. They can produce like a 4-wheel car for $10,000. What would cost us $35,000, $40,000 here, they can do it for about 10 or less. This is where the video was made on these kinds of tables, and this is where the assembly of electronics is happening. This is a mill that's making synthetic material, based on an oil product. There's 500 of these looms in this one room. There were 4 rooms on this scale, and they were building more. And each one of these looms that makes material is worth about half a million dollars. It's Danish made. And like I said, there were 500 per room. So what's happening, and I counted the figures, I only counted maybe 15 people working all of these 500 machines. So they're using low-paid labor, the best technology that money can buy, and working at scale. So there's really no way in which we in the West can compete with that kind of formula and that's why we continue to be able to buy clothing and things that they seem far more valuable than what we're paying for them, but we're able to get that reduced price because of that massive workforce. This is one of the largest clothing manufacturers, and they're actually making, here they're making hospital suits. But Young Or is, again, the largest clothing manufacturer with, again, about 250,000 employees. China's largest domestic cell phone manufacturer, Bird Mobile it's called, and China at the time in 2005 was selling 20 million cell phones per month into China. This is the lunchroom for the textile industry. A chicken packing plant. So they're producing 100 million, they were processing 100 million chickens per year. And when you think of that, when you think of I checked to see how many fowl were in China on any given day. On any given day, if you had counted all the fowl, there would be over 6 billion birds that they're raising for China to continue to be able to feed all the people in China. This 100 million chickens in this 1 year's production would not even produce enough chicken if a chicken was good for a family of 4, for one meal in one day, for one meal, like a lunch, would supply a third of China for lunch, the whole year's production, 100 million chickens. So again, we're working with scales that are, again, unprecedented. This is a big factory that makes coffee makers. And if you see the movie Manufactured Landscapes, it shows the opening panning shot. The opening shot is running along one of the factories on the left and it just shows you the absolute vastness of the industry. This is inside the coffee maker factory. So they're making about 3 million coffee makers a year, and they make irons for ironing clothes. They make 22 million of those a year. And the iron that they make, it goes out of their factory for an iron that would sell for $20, $25 here. That factory is being paid $3 to make it. Big industries, they make parts, the big things for mining industry. These were old, so I went and photographed some of the old state industries as well, because these have all disappeared now. These have all been flattened, and shiny new factories have been put in. So, like, this is an aluminum factory. When it was running, it employed 20,000 Chinese. The new aluminum plant this is abandoned. The new one that replaced it just down the road employs 2,000. So they lost 18,000 workers in one shot to modernization. I then went to think about oil. That I saw one of the things that's allowing this human expansion to rapidly move at such a rate was the fact that the internal combustion engine and oil not only allowed us transportation, but it also gave us a mechanical advantage in the landscape to move vast amounts of material quickly and to be able to expand that. So any species tends to expand within the allowable energy envelope. And the energy envelope was all of a sudden greatly enhanced by humans when we discovered oil. And there was tons of it out there once we can figure out how to tap into it. And it's that oil that is allowing the human expansion, or at least I feel that it's at the core of the human expansion at this rate in the 20th century and now the 21st. So I went to where oil was first discovered. This is the oil fields around Bakersfield in Southern California. These are, again, the landscape where oil is extracted. This is pump jacks. This is where it's pumped out. This area here has about 15,000 of these pumps. This is in Canada. This is the oil sands where they're removing oil from the sand. Very controversial. It's a very dirty way of making oil. This is, they have to heat the sand up to about 80 degrees Celsius, and then the oil drops out, and then they're able to separate the sand from the oil. And then once the sand is removed, then they have to put all that sand somewhere. So it goes into these tailings ponds, but these tailings ponds still have quite a bit of oil in it. There's still oil with that sand. They can't get all the oil off the sand. So it accumulates in these big, vast ponds, which are very dangerous to the local wildlife, also very toxic in terms of if it goes into the river, it can create a lot of havoc in the river. But this gives you an idea how they're mining. So they're mining for oil here. It's a mining operation. It's the largest surface mining operation, not depth-wise, but across a vast area in the world. And they take off the forest off the top, and then they go down 20 feet, and at 20 feet underground, they start to hit oil. This is an ancient seabed. So oil comes from the seabeds, ancient seas. Coal comes from ancient forests and peat. So those are, so when they discover oil, they're discovering ancient plankton, ancient sea life. These are all the tailings ponds. This is another way in which they're extracting oil in Canada. They're piping the oil down, like they're piping steam underground at 800 feet, because this seabed runs across all of North America. It comes up in the northern Alberta, it comes up close enough to be able to mine it, but that same seabed goes all the way down to Texas, right through the middle of North America. But they can still get it at 800 to 1,000 feet, even 600 feet. So they're injecting steam at 600 feet for about 3 months, and then it softens it, and the separation occurs under the ground, and then they're able to pump it back up. And that's how it's called in situ oil, or SAGD. And they're allowed to, they're able to extract oil on a vast, so the extraction of the oil in the oil sands is going to be done this way more than the open pit way. There's more of it that they can get this way than by open pit. I also went to look at, the industry that converts that oil into products that we use, into lubricants and fertilizers and gasoline and jet fuel and diesel and propane and butane. So these are the machines, these structures, these exoskeletons that crack the oil and separate the various components and the various things that we use every day are created in places like this. So, and to me it was interesting because it was like this outside machine, but yet there were these crazy complex pipes, machines built specific, but to me they had this kind of sense of a cathedral. And then started to look at the big refineries. This is an oil tanker that's unloading its oil in Texas. This is in China, some of the infrastructure that's being built to support the car. This is in LA. A 4-level, this is one of the busiest and biggest intersections. And I chose LA because LA is where they invented the freeway. It's where they invented the suburb, pretty much. So it was the epicenter where it all began. And so I thought, again, referencing LA was important in the oil book because, that's where this urban sprawl began, and that's where the freeway, where a car culture was born, that you needed to have a car to live in LA. And if anybody's been to LA, you quickly realize that you have to have a car. It's the infrastructure and the public transport, which was purchased in the early, I think in the 40s, the public transit was purchased by Goodyear Tire, and because they didn't want people to use public transit, and then they closed it all down and then started building roads so that people would buy more tires. Las Vegas was the fastest growing suburb. So here's Las Vegas. They built fake waterfront property, and that's a fake lagoon. So they built a lagoon in a desert where the Lake Mead is sinking at 6 inches a month, and yet somehow the city and the developers decide that it'd be good for real estate prices if they had waterfront property in the middle of Las Vegas. This is where the quarry, the pit, for all the material for building the city has been met by the city. So they never expected the city to ever come out to where they were withdrawing the material, but yet the city meets the open pit. And this is what they're building. House after house, air conditioning, car-driven culture. And looking at cars, these are Volkswagens in Texas. They're being brought over from Germany and China because they make them all over the world. But this is the logistics yard for distributing Volkswagens. This is taxis in China. This is 9,000 taxis, all, again, by Volkswagen going into China, Shanghai and Beijing. I then also looked at oil cultures. This is a truck beauty pageant, so the cultures were around the machine. This is land speed records in Bonneville, so in Utah, where they try to break land records with these machines that people build, motors. And this is in 180,000 people at a NASCAR race in Talladega, near Birmingham. So again, looking at the theater of oil, looking at where oil and the machine is at the core of the event. So this is like just giving you when you look at this print, you see the massive amount of machinery and trailers and mobile homes and et cetera, et cetera. It just gives you a phenomenal view of it. This is where people with Harley Davidsons and other types of bikes gather for a rally in Sturgis in North Dakota. 500,000 bikers arrive in this town. This is the bikers' parking lot for a concert, a rock concert. Also looking at the kind of drive-through culture and the franchise culture that we've built, so that you don't have to leave your car, that you can just drive through. Also looking at the end of oil. So all things are entropic, everything has an end. This is some abandoned oil platforms in Azerbaijan. These are abandoned oil fields in Azerbaijan, abandoned 20 years ago, also from Azerbaijan. So these are landscapes pretty much left for dead, that there's really, the oil, and this is actually one of the few places, what you're looking at there, that liquid or that surface is oil. So this is one of the few places that you actually ever saw oil. When you see oil, it's usually a spill, it's a problem. It's kind of, I see it as blood in our veins. If you see it, you've got a problem. Well, oil is in the same way. It's an energy, and if we see it in the landscape, it's toxic. It's going to cause problems. But here, that reflection that you're looking at is actually all oil. These are abandoned aircraft in Phoenix, Arizona. Abandoned jet fighters. These are abandoned helicopters from the Korean War. Or again, these are all jet engines, all being ripped out for recycling. Phoenix is also known for the place to get scrap parts for your car. So they have thousands. It's got the lowest dew point. It's the driest place in the United States. These are crushed or densified oil barrels. These are engines, auto engines, all being collected for recycling. These are oil filters from your car, again collected for recycling. This is one of the biggest tire piles in the world, and it caught fire soon after I photographed it. 2 months later, it caught fire. Burned for 2 years. There were 30 million tires. And the shipbreaking yards where they break oil tankers. That oil tankers, after the Exxon Valdez, they weren't going to insure single-hulled ships anymore, so they had to go and find a way to deal with all of those tankers. So they said, well, we're only going to insure double-hulled ships. So these single-hulled oil tankers, the biggest vessels ever built by man, were going to be broken down by workers. So I went to see where that happens, and it happened in Bangladesh and in India. I couldn't get into Bangladesh, but I did get into. I couldn't get into India, but I did get into Bangladesh. This is probably the most frightening and harsh workplaces that I'd ever seen. When I went and looked at this, I felt like I was stepping back and looking at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution 150, 200 years ago. Something, like Charles Dickens would have seen in Hard Times, and the way he transcribed satanic mills. So these were very much like those crazy satanic mills. It was a dangerous and polluted, unhealthy workplace that I'd ever seen. And dangerous in that I think they were averaging about 2 deaths per day, plus many other accidents, fingers gone, arms gone. It was unbelievable the amount of injury that was happening in these yards. But there were about 25,000 workers taking these ships apart. This is what you're looking here is an inside wall of an oil tanker. So this is what the inside wall would look like. And they salvaged all the oil that they could find. They scraped it out of the bottom of these ships and they would put it into these big pools. This is an oil salvage operation. And this is in Bangladesh. It showed that literally these men worked barefoot, and this is oil that's filled their footprints, which I thought was somehow poetic. This is a recent oil spill. I did some work. This is currently showing in London as big oversized prints, 60 by 80 prints. But if you look in the top, at the very top, there's a ship up top, and that's a regular sized ship. So this drilling rig in the foreground is massive. And this is the rig that is drilling the relief hole to stop the hole that was spilling into 60,000 barrels into the Gulf of Mexico. So the Macondo hole. So this was drilling the relief well. But to me it was interesting. It was this kind of Frankenstein story where the technology that we built got out of our hands. It got away from us. And now, the drilling rig that was able to make the hole that caused the problem, all of a sudden it's surrounded by the monstrous oil, the energy that's released. So to me, it had a real powerful metaphor. This wild energy surrounding this ship. This is a similar kind of metaphor I'm working towards. And I'm just going to show you a couple quick pictures. I'm doing water now. So this idea of using water and how we use water, I think it's the second most important liquid after, well, oil and water are equally two of the most valuable resources to humans at this point. But this is looking at, shipping water through a desert in California to be able to create this. So that same water you're seeing just down the road takes desert and converts it into viable farmland. And so this is like, to me it was a very potent way to begin to talk about water. This is a distressed landscape where they're having to irrigate Owens Lake because they drained it to supply water to Los Angeles. They drained a complete lake in inner California. And now Los Angeles had to pay over $1 billion to plumb a sprinkler system so that dust storms wouldn't come out of this valley, out of this lake bed, and create toxic dust storms, because it was a lot of leftover chemicals from farming. This is also that lake bed, the Owens Lake. And then this is around the Salton Sea in California, where another body of water became so much salt got into it, became overly salinated. And so all of a sudden, all the fish started to die, and this whole development that was started all of a sudden failed because nobody would move to that area. So again, it's something in the desert where things have gone wrong. I also looked at wells, step wells in India, so I'm just giving you a random few things of the new work that I'm doing. These are, again, step wells. This is how in India, in the northern Rajasthan, how they go down and get their water. But again, this is an indicator that they're draining their water tables with conventional pumps. So they're pumping out the water. So this used to always have water in it, and now for the last decade, this has never seen water, this step well. And it's largely just a garbage repository now. So again, being able to show water as a finite resource, this image began to do that as well for me. And then the celebration of water, the spiritual. This is a Kumela festival where 10 million Indians arrive on a single day to bathe in the Yangtze River, in the Ganges River. So this was a day that the 10 million arrived on one day, and to celebrate water. And that's it. So thank you very much.
Chiamo Enrica Viganò, la curatrice della mostra, e Giuseppe Frangi anche, che ha scritto un saggio nel nostro catalogo. Abbiamo assistito a una grandissima sequenza di luoghi, di storie, di immagini e anche di temi sociali e temi dell'arte connessi. Mi ha molto colpito che nell'incedere Burtynsky diceva spesso: non potevo non andare anche lì, non potevo non guardare a quella situazione, quasi come alla ricerca di un filo di collegamento tra tutti questi fattori che abbiamo visto, ma dentro, in sintesi, in questo rapporto fondamentale e profondo tra l'uomo e la terra in cui vive, l'uomo e la realtà. E infatti questo sublime che ci lascia senza fiato a volte è appunto questo scaturigine da questo rapporto. Io vorrei chiedere a loro due se hanno un'osservazione, una domanda da fare a Burtynsky, per poi chiedere anche a voi di intervenire. L'ora è certamente abbastanza già tarda, ma possiamo sfruttare questa bella occasione. Chi vuole di voi?
Eccomi. Innanzitutto grazie di questo viaggio che ci ha fatto fare, perché è un'opportunità unica di avere uno sguardo largo su quello che è la condizione del mondo oggi. Io, guardando le sue foto, c'è un aspetto che mi colpisce. Sente? C'è un aspetto che mi colpisce, cioè che da una parte c'è la documentazione di una situazione a volte al limite, a volte ha superato anche il limite. Sembra un mondo destinato a un punto terminale, no? Che si documenta una situazione terminale. Però dall'altra parte le immagini sono di una bellezza sconcertante, cioè anche faccio riferimento in particolare alle immagini delle miniere o alle immagini di quei treni che tagliano le montagne. Sono quindi l'esito è anche di una bellezza che colpisce, che quasi affascina, direi, no? Quindi come si conciliano questi due aspetti? Cioè come la bellezza delle immagini riesce a mantenere l'allarme e la drammaticità del contenuto che viene raccontato.
The issue of bringing beauty as one of the components to transcribe that world. I think it's interesting. I've been having this conversation with different people at different times, but it seems that photography bears the ethical weight and maybe the criticism of saying, oh, well, you can't depict something that is what we see as, or what we think of as a tragic situation in a beautiful way, but yet all through history, that's how we've told stories. If we think of Shakespeare, the tragedies that he wrote about are man's inhumanity to man, even to how families tear each other apart, are written in the most beautiful prose that you can imagine. If you think of movies, you can think of Apocalypse Now, Francis Ford Coppola making a gorgeous, beautiful, seductive movie of a horrific situation, and yet no one questions the fact that beauty is used. And so, in a way, what I felt that the 20th century did is it walked away from beauty, probably for many reasons. The aesthetics were seen as something that was bourgeois. The artists no longer wanted to supply that bourgeois with artifacts of their making to have trophies of their work on their walls. So there was a reaction against that. There was probably a reaction against aesthetics from the wars of the First and Second World War, and in that modern period, abstraction came in and other things, but beauty was considered no longer an option in the visual arts. And I didn't feel that way. I felt that the aesthetic component is something that is universally understood, that when an image is made and it draws the viewer in, then you now are communicating. You're actually bringing information across a bridge through a medium, and photography is that fantastic medium of delineating our world in such excruciating detail that I felt I didn't want the person to avert their eyes. I wanted them to be challenged by this attraction repulsion, that you're in a state of flux. You can't be stable in there. You either are drawn to it and you're actually thrown out of it as well. And it's in that kind of dynamic of that goes on in the viewer, this inability to reconcile these two things, that I believe is the force in the work. And I think that's why people are finding this work interesting, and it is finding audiences. And it's not just in Italy. I can show this work in Japan. I can show this work in China, and it has the same effect. So the visual language is a universal language. And so I was interested in being able to harness that language to bring difficult stories into our consciousness.
Buonasera a tutti, grazie infinite Ed per questa presentazione. Sicuramente la maestosità delle tue immagini ci porta a mostrare l'orrore attraverso la bellezza e a farci riflettere. Però una cosa che mi affascina tantissimo è comunque la fase di ricerca, prima di questo scatto contemplativo che poi riesci a fare. C'è un lavoro di ricerca, di indagine, di documentazione importantissimo, e mi chiedevo come lo organizzi, perché è una cosa fuori dal tempo, in questi tempi in cui il reportage deve essere rapidissimo nella realizzazione. Come ti organizzi se hai una squadra di molte persone che ti appoggiano?
I basically, in the research side of it, I tend probably for the last 4 or 5 years, I've literally had a full-time researcher doing research for me. Like for water, I might say, go out and find out where the largest desalination plants in the world are. Or I might say, where is the largest redirection of water occurring currently in the world. So I might have these kinds of questions, and I put them forward to a researcher, and then they would go out and find those answers. Or if I have somebody who's specializing in China, they would then be able to go in to an area. I'd actually hire them to go and maybe fly to that area and with a digital camera capture what's there. Let me see currently what does it look like. So the way I work is I probably spend 9 to 10 months out of the year engaged in various forms of research and production, and what I call this is dissemination, taking the work out into the world and talking and having exhibitions. And then there's probably about 2 to 3 months where I actually shoot. That's broken up throughout the year. And it may take me 6 months to a year to get into one location. I've worked on certain locations. That shot of the motorcycle rally in Sturgis, that was 3 years of negotiations to be able to make that picture. Oftentimes my images are in a long chain of letter writing and trying to coax them, trying to convince them, trying to get other people to write letters on my behalf, like the Canadian Embassy or government officials and things of that nature. So I'm constantly working fairly high levels of government and bureaucracies to be able to get access into factories and into what most would consider sensitive areas. I'm currently, as far as I know, the only photographer, and for sure the only Western photographer, but they said I'm the only photographer shooting some of the largest dams being built up on the Mekong River, up on the border of Burma and Tibet. So the Yangtze and the Salween River and the Mekong are all converging in this one area in the Yunnan province, and I'm currently photographing them. So it's about connections, and it's about persistence and patience. I think those are the things.
Ecco, c'è a metà sala la possibilità di un microfono. Se abbiamo qualche qui davanti, 2 subito, magari le raccogliamo insieme, così poi se si vogliono preparare altri, ci sono.
Okay.
Prego.
Okay. First of all, I would like to say that I really appreciate your work, but I wonder if I really think to what do you tell us? It's a really negative, it's a really sad story. So I wonder, and you must be really conscious about all this, what you're telling us. So I wonder, how do you manage to use a car, to use your cell phone, and whatever, and especially, how do you manage not being depressed?
No.
Seeing all this.
It's a good question. Well, I think the way I'm very much a humanist, and I have a high regard for the human spirit and what humans are capable of, and that I certainly believe that hope is an important aspect of a position we need to take, because if you become hopeless, then cynicism is, nothing can be done. And I don't believe we're in that dire place yet where nothing can be done. But I do believe we're in a place where something has to be done, and that there isn't a lot of time. So for me, I'm engaging the tools that the machinery makes to deliver a message. I can't deliver that message. I can't show those landscapes unless I use the jets and the phones and the fuel necessary to get me to those places. And given all the kind of fuel that's used for really idiotic things, I feel it's okay to use some for something that may help, may add to the consciousness or to the awareness of what we as a collective are having as an impact on the planet. And the question becomes, is the world a better place with or without these images to describe who we are and to describe this part of our narrative? And I'd like to believe it's better that we have these images to help us understand who we are and what we're doing.
All'inizio at the beginnings of your conference, you were talking about one of your landscapes, and you said that there was no life there. And I started thinking that we are both defeated, I mean nature and human beings. At the end of your presentation, I thought that there is no direct counterposition between human beings and the effects on landscape. So I was wondering about, is it a political choice? I mean, many people cannot choose what to do if they refuse a kind of job or something. So is it an artistic choice? Because if you most of all want to focus on landscape, both of them, something else?
Well, it's interesting, and I think if I understand your question, is that not everybody has a choice of what they can and can't do, and is it and the question I guess I'm wondering is, are you wondering whether it's a personal political choice or whether it's a choice of politics that we choose, you know, in terms of who runs our countries and what's their position? But on a personal political way, I think real change, the change that is important, is in our own behavior. When we start changing our own personal behavior, which may be a changing of our politics too, just saying, you know, at every decision, I'm going to try and do the right thing, to not eat a fish that's endangered, to not, unnecessarily use fuel to make my home as efficient as possible, to do all the things I possibly can to try and buy food from local farmers. You know, there's 1,000 different ways in which we can make decisions to reduce our impact as an individual. So I think those are real changes. Those are important changes, and we shouldn't hesitate in moving along that path if we care. If we have children and we care what world they inherit, I mean, I think that's a great motivator. I became more motivated personally once I had children because I was concerned about the world that we were delivering them, and I think that's and that's something that I think is very true for anybody who wants to go. When you're a parent, you start thinking outside of yourself to the next generation, to life, where you may not be there, but you want them to have a pleasant life or a comfortable life like possibly that you've had. My feeling, I have a lot less optimism in the political system, both internationally and within countries, even our own country, Canada, United States, and very few governments. You've got a little bit of hope in the Scandinavian countries and Germany, and they've all taken major green initiatives. But most countries are status quo, and government isn't putting in regulation or making the tough decisions. And I can see that it's not just the government's fault; it's the electorate. If a government goes and puts a carbon tax, and it puts the country into recession, they'll never get reelected. Period. We won't elect them again because you did something that caused us unemployment and pain. So why would we bring you in? So it's a very tricky thing to implement and impose policies that are right for the environment and also good for humans as well. That we may not be able to achieve the cuts that we need in consumption without some pain. And are we prepared to take that pain? Is a big question. So government, until we start asking for governments to level the playing field. And so quite frankly, I think the easiest and smartest thing we can do is to stop encouraging or subsidizing oil and actually put the proper cost of burning oil, like the externalized cost. So let's say burning a ton of gas is into the atmosphere may have a downstream cost of $100 a ton, and that's where we have to get to. So a tax that starts at 10 or 15 and moves to 100 to eventually put the proper cost to that consumptor, so the consumer pays, will quickly begin to accelerate alternatives. But as long as we subsidize it and allow big oil to make decisions and to keep policies like in America from being enacted, then they'll continue to externalize those costs, and we won't be able to move to cleaner. Because I believe that it doesn't have to be dire. I think we can retool ourselves to actually be real producers of energy. Because I disagree with anybody who says that they're oil producers. They're oil extractors. Nature produced the oil. They're just taking it out of the ground and changing it chemically to be useful for us. But when we make solar and when we do wind power, solar power, wave power, geothermal, that's producing energy. That's us producing it. And that's the big difference. So we need to move away from extracting easy energy and producing real long-term solutions to our energy problems.
Lì al centro.
Grazie. Thank you. Hello. Please let me thank you for the very clear exposition. It's quite unusual, and it's incredibly reassuring to be able to participate in what is an incredible project in such clear terms. My pretty obvious question is, you obviously started your career in documentation, and you confessed that it was well paid for, to become now one of the foremost artists in the photography scene. Shows in museums, wonderful publications, books. Your photos are being sold in art fairs. I'd like to know, being in the field myself, where do you draw the line? To what extent do you consider yourself a documentation photographer, and when do you see yourself, or when do you begin seeing yourself as an artist? Some of the photographs which you conveyed had incredible poetic effects, emotional. Others were just mind-blowing in what you denounce, but perhaps less artistically orientated. I think it's an interesting issue because photography does bear this ambiguous line in today's market. To what extent is it art? To what extent is it documentation? Thank you.
In many respects, every photograph on some level can stand as a document. It's a carrier of information. And it's interesting that they become more evident as carriers of information the older they get. So when we look at images from 1880 or 1890, and it's a picture out on the street of, we see what cars they drove and the typefaces that they put on their businesses, and the way they wore their hair and their coats that they wore or whatever. That the person at the time wasn't thinking that they were creating a document that would somehow sum up the values and the aesthetics and the times that they were in. They were making a photograph in the moment of the place where they lived or near where they lived. So I think that photographs carry, I think there's two polarities. That on the one polarity, we can see kind of like reportage and documentary. And reportage being more of looking for current events, looking for conflict, looking for floods, anything that's happening, a murder scene, that the journalist is there covering an event. And I don't see myself in that light as somebody who's chasing these kinds of events. To me, mine is an intentional landscape created a day at a time to produce an end result, a profit for a group of shareholders, and things that we use every day, and that's what I see when I see those landscapes. But what I'm trying to do is use, I guess, my skills as a photographer and understanding light, understanding tone, line, shape, texture, and applying it to a whole array of possible subjects. So I'm led by the ideas, and I'll say, okay, I've got this idea to photograph a desalination plant. I've never photographed one yet, but I've got an idea, and it'll probably resonate. I'll probably pick up things that I learned when I photographed refineries, because they were just another kind of refinery. So I kind of include them in the narrative, because to me, I'm letting the subject, be part of the work. And I see, for me, where this image is successful is when neither the content or the form overpowers the other, so that they're both of equal power, so that the subject and the form, the image and its ability to capture our imagination, to make us stop, to invoke a sense of wonder of what this place is. So that's, to me, a part of the form, getting the light right, the line right, the composition, the colors, all those things, the time of year, all those things have to coalesce. And when I get that right, then I know I'm there with the content, because there's a 30-year compendium of ideas. And this is another one that I believe is strong enough to fit this compendium. Now I have to find a way to make an image of it that will appear as if it came through my authored voice, and that becomes a part of something that fits into the larger body of work. So I want that kind of, I'm looking for that kind of image that would easily, say, oh yeah, that fits in with what I've done, that it's just one more addition component to the larger body. And I do agree, some feel more documentary and some feel more artistic, and that's just, I think it's subject driven. I think some subjects allow themselves to go into that greater abstraction, and others don't. But I don't want to disclude the ones that don't, because I feel that they still add significant dimensions to the narrative.
Ce n'è un'ultima? Oppure... Ecco, allora concludiamo questo nostro incontro. Vorrei suggerire un piccolo pensiero sintetico che non intende essere una chiusura, ma un'apertura. Mi colpiva nel dialogo e nelle domande e nelle risposte questo rapporto appunto tra forza, bellezza e maestosità di una lotta epica dell'uomo, e nello stesso tempo delle sue conseguenze. Ecco, il suggerimento è ripensare alla parola sublime che è uscita questa sera, e che trattandosi anche di fotografia e quindi anche di documentazione e arte, in un equilibrio giusto tra questi due poli, sublime nasce da un limite che accende un rapporto con la verità, con l'ultimo, con le cose ultime. Io credo che Burtynsky documenti nella terra, nel rapporto dell'uomo con la sua realtà e con i suoi fini, con il perseguimento dei suoi interessi e desideri, esattamente questi due poli in cui c'è la scarica elettrica. Questa scarica elettrica sono come dire le immagini, e la forza della sua ricerca è questa capacità di reperirle, di invenirle, cioè di trovarle nel nostro mondo. Certo c'è un messaggio etico al fondo, ma nel contempo dobbiamo trovare in qualche modo la risposta che unisce come una calamita i due poli, altrimenti rimanderemo tutto a un pensiero di cambiare il nostro futuro o di dichiarare il nostro passato un niente, una bruttura. E il punto di calamita è pensare che l'uomo che agisce anche in quelle miniere ha il problema e il tema della propria felicità come soddisfazione della propria umanità, non soddisfazione delle proprie voglie immediate, naturalmente, o egoismi. Ecco, queste due cose convivono dentro la situazione più drammatica e tragica, o dentro la più grande volonterosità, dentro la più grande impegno. Colpisce che per arrivare nel fondo di una cava, quella del Cile, dove non c'è neanche viva una mosca, quindi forse è giusto anche farla, occorre la geometria e l'ordine per arrivare in fondo. Non sia possibile arrivarci attraverso il disordine o attraverso il non pensiero. Ecco, questo tema del sublime io credo che sia dentro in ogni atto e azione umana, e l'arte lo sa in qualche modo sorprendere. In ultimo chiudo con un'immagine. Lewis Hine, di cui qualche anno fa abbiamo riportato le sue immagini al Centro Culturale di Milano, quelle sia delle costruzioni dell'Empire State Building ma anche quelle delle fabbriche, erano gli anni 20 e 30. Lewis Hine era un sociologo, Burtynsky era un lavoratore che vedeva un mondo cambiare, un mondo che lo affascinava anche dal punto di vista tecnico. A un certo punto Hine non ha avuto più le parole per insegnare sociologia, ma ha voluto usare l'immagine per mostrare, documentare ciò di cui forse andava già parlando nelle sue lezioni. Ecco, ma in quel documento c'è uno sguardo di Hine, così come nelle fotografie c'è uno sguardo di Burtynsky, che io credo che affondi le radici in questa dinamica profonda, che non può dire tutto è giusto è a destra, tutto il male è a sinistra, ma che sia esattamente in questo sublime, che certo la risposta non è solo l'arte, ma è il suggerimento, come ha detto lui, di un qualcosa su cui creare un nuovo pensiero. Però il pensiero profondo va a quegli uomini che a sera tornano a casa dopo le navi smontate, uno muore, l'altro no, e c'è il tema dei loro dialoghi, c'è il tema dei loro istanti, c'è il tema della loro umanità che vibra in questi paesaggi vuoti o in questi paesaggi pieni di umano. Io con questo voglio anche così consegnare il pensiero che ci ha colpito nel fare questa mostra, e spero di aver anche dato un accompagnamento all'intento di Burtynsky e dell'artista. La mostra prosegue fino al 25 marzo, c'è un prezioso filmato di circa un'ora, Manufactured Landscape, che appunto ci fa vedere tutto il movimento prima o dopo le immagini, questi quadri che abbiamo visto scorrere questa sera in così largo numero. Quindi c'è una documentazione che tra l'altro è preziosissima dal punto di vista dei 3 anni, 5 o 10 per avere i permessi di stare in Cina o in altri luoghi. Quindi vedere questo filmato e vedere un pezzo di mondo contemporaneo in latitudini diverse, quindi avere la possibilità, comodi su una sedia, di sfruttare l'energia del nostro grande autore. Grazie ancora a tutti voi, grazie a lui, un augurio per il suo lavoro